Picture this. You stand beneath the Athenian sun so bright it feels like judgment. The marble columns of the Acropolis rise above you, immaculate, eternal, as if even the gods themselves had chosen to live here. Every surface gleams with perfection. Every statue, every muscle, every curve has been crafted to honor the body as divine geometry. But the longer you stare, the stranger it becomes. Because behind that flawless beauty, something else begins to move, an unease, a pulse, a whisper beneath the stone. The Greeks called it kalokagathia, the belief that physical beauty reflected inner virtue. A perfect body meant a perfect soul. But like all civilizations that worship perfection, they could not stop themselves from testing where the boundary lay between admiration and possession. And that's where the trouble began. In the gymnasiums of Athens, marble-floored temples to the human form, young men trained in total nudity. To them, it was an act of purity, skin unshamed before the gods. But to modernize, the line between reverence and obsession feels uncomfortably thin. The air reeked of olive oil and sweat. Philosophers lectured under colonnades, while rows of glistening bodies practiced wrestling holds that blurred education into intimacy. It was here that Greek ideas about love and control were born. They called it paideia, the education of the soul. But that education was often shaped by those who saw beauty not as something to inspire, but something to own. For the elite, mentoring a youth wasn't just about philosophy. It was about legacy, influence, power disguised as affection. These relationships were celebrated in art and poetry, immortalized as pure spiritual devotion. Yet beneath the verses, you can still hear the silence of those who didn't have the power to refuse. To the Greeks, desire wasn't shameful. It was divine. The gods themselves modeled it, Zeus turning into a swan, a bull, even a shower of gold to satisfy his appetite. The myths made lust sacred, transforming impulse into theology. But when divinity excuses indulgence, cruelty becomes culture. In Sparta, young boys were raised in the agog, a system designed to make warriors by breaking children. They were torn from their families at 7, starved, beaten, and hardened. Their instructors taught that affection forged loyalty, and loyalty demanded submission. The Spartans called it discipline. Historians might call it trauma refined into patriotism. Back in Athens, things were more polished, more philosophical, more poetic. But the result was the same. The body was both weapon and worship. Sculptors chiseled flesh until marble seemed to breathe. Painters covered vases with scenes they called heroic, though the heroes looked disturbingly human. You can still see them in museums. Glossy terracotta figures locked in impossible embraces, frozen in myth but unmistakably mortal. The Victorians who unearthed them blushed and wrote vague catalog notes, athletic exercise, ritual display, anything to avoid naming what was clearly visible. But the Greeks didn't blush. They celebrated. They believed the act itself could mirror cosmic balance, that dominance and submission were natural, even sacred. In their minds, order required hierarchy. Even pleasure had to obey the chain of command. It's easy to admire ancient Greece from a distance, the birthplace of democracy, philosophy, art, reason. But up close, its foundations look less like marble and more like myth used as camouflage. Behind every statue of a perfect youth, there was someone less perfect, a servant polishing the stone, a slave holding the chisel. a body treated as material for another man's idea of beauty. For every poet who wrote about divine love, there was another voice erased the ones who were loved without choice. The Greeks called themselves civilized, and in many ways they were. But civilization is not the absence of cruelty. It is the ability to refine cruelty into ritual to make it look graceful, noble, inevitable. When foreign travelers wrote home about Athens, they marveled at the temples, the theater, the intelligence. But in their private diaries, they wrote something else. That the Greeks were both the wisest and the strangest people on earth. That their pursuit of beauty bordered on madness. That their love of the body sometimes looked like worship and sometimes like war. Because beneath every ideal of order, there is always hunger. And Greece, for all its light, its philosophy, its symmetry, was a civilization built on the quiet, persistent hum of desire. A world that taught the West to think, but also to look too long at its own reflection. Imagine standing inside a quiet Athenian symposium. The lamps burn low, perfuming the air with resin and smoke. Bronze cups glint in the light as philosophers recline on couches, debating virtue and beauty. Outside, the city hums vendors closing their stalls, priests locking temple gates, but in here, time slows. Wine flows, words dance, and somewhere between the laughter and the logic, reason begins to blur. This was where the Greeks believed ideas were born in rooms that smelled of wine, sweat, and incense. Here, wisdom and indulgence shared the same couch. And for many, philosophy itself became the perfect disguise for desire. They called it Erastes and Eromenos, the lover and the beloved. It was the foundation of many so-called educational relationships between older men and adolescent boys. To the Greeks, it was noble. The transmission of wisdom, discipline, and virtue through affection. Plato wrote about it as a kind of divine ascent love, leading the soul toward truth. But philosophy has always been dangerous when it begins to justify pleasure. When Plato spoke of divine madness, he meant inspiration. But others took it more literally. What began as metaphor, the soul's love for beauty, became ritualized power over the beautiful. Behind the elegant language of mentorship was a system that allowed the elite to shape, claim, and sometimes destroy the young minds they called disciples. To question it was unthinkable. Athens was obsessed with appearances, balance, harmony, moderation. Yet moderation is a myth in any culture that believes itself enlightened. Because the more perfectly a society explains its own morality, the easier it becomes to conceal what it refuses to see. And in the candlelit rooms of philosophers, words became shields. Phrases like divine love, sacred affection, virtue through intimacy, they all sound noble until you realize they are just sophisticated ways of describing ownership. One story survives, rarely told in polite classrooms. It concerns Socrates, the father of Western philosophy, and Alcibiades, his brilliant and beautiful student. Alcibiades described how Socrates slept beside him one night, teaching him the virtues of restraint. He claimed nothing improper happened. Maybe he was telling the truth, or maybe the truth had already learned to keep quiet in Athens. Even now, historians argue whether these accounts reveal love, mentorship, or manipulation. The answer, of course, is all three. The Greeks blurred those lines deliberately because blurred lines protect the powerful. In the symposium, conversation was art. But beneath the poetry of philosophy was performance. Each speech, each exchange of glances, was part of an unspoken negotiation wisdom offered in exchange for admiration. Flattery traded for proximity. When Socrates spoke of beauty as the visible form of the good, the room fell silent. The listeners nodded in reverence, but some of them, those who understood the subtext, also smiled. Because in a society that deified beauty, beauty itself became currency and everyone knew its price. There was no privacy in Greek thought, not in art, not in conversation, not in the body. Everything was a spectacle, meant to be seen, judged, perfected. The symposium became the stage where intellect and desire performed a duet so convincing that even centuries later, we struggle to separate them. And yet, not everyone joined the chorus. A few voices, playwrights, outsiders, women whispered their dissent. Euripides mocked the philosophers who preached virtue but practiced vanity. Aristophanes, with his sharp humor, turned symposiums into comedies of hypocrisy. He saw what others refused to admit, that the thinkers who lectured on moderation could not moderate themselves. The real paradox of Greek philosophy is that it sought to explain everything except its own excess. The same men who warned against temptation created entire systems to excuse it. The same city that claimed democracy excluded half its population from the definition of human. In Athens, wisdom was freedom, but only for those allowed to speak, and for everyone else, philosophy was just another mask civilization wore to hide its appetites. When later generations studied Greek thought, they inherited both the brilliance and the blindness. The Enlightenment praised Athens for reason, art, and science, forgetting the boys trained to serve as silent symbols of their teachers' ideals. Victorian scholars translated Plato but omitted his verses on love. Museums displayed the marble youth, carefully avoiding the stories carved beneath their beauty. And so, like the Greeks themselves, we learned to admire the form and ignore the cost. In the flicker of a symposium lamp, you can almost see it, the silhouette of Socrates, the laughter of Alcibiades, the hum of conversation turning into something quieter, heavier. Philosophy dissolving into performance, morality merging with indulgence. That's the paradox of the Greek mind. The civilization that gave the world logic could not reason its way out of its own desires. Because beneath every argument for virtue lies a hidden truth that humans will always find a way to make their appetites sound divine. And in Athens, they did it better than anyone. Picture the mountain of Cithaeron on a night without stars. The wind moves like a whisper through the pines. Torches sway in the darkness. From the valley below, you hear drums slow at first, then faster until the rhythm becomes a heartbeat you can feel beneath your ribs. The Athenians called this ekstasisto, stand outside oneself. It was not a metaphor. It was a goal. This was the world of Dionysus, god of wine and madness, the only deity who promised freedom from reason. In daylight, Greece worshipped logic and symmetry. At night, it surrendered to him. His followers gathered in forests and mountain groves, drinking until the boundaries between body and spirit blurred. They believed that through frenzy, they could taste divinity, that intoxication was not escape, but revelation. The rites began innocently enough. Hymns, music, the sharing of wine. But each song carried an undertone of rebellion, each cup another step away from order. The citizens who spent their days quoting Plato now danced barefoot in the mud, shouting praises to the god who destroyed restraint. They tore branches from trees, crowned themselves with ivy, and called it holiness. Archaeologists later found fragments of pottery showing these festivals. At first glance, they look like scenes of joy figures dancing, arms raised to heaven. Look closer, and you see eyes rolled back. Mouths open in something between laughter and scream. The art never lies. Greece painted its nightmares in red clay and called them celebrations. In Corinth, another temple ruled by a different god offered its own path to salvation. The temple of Aphrodite stood on the hill of Acrocorinth, visible for Mylesa, gleaming fortress of desire. By day, travelers climbed its marble steps to pray for love, fertility, or simple luck. By night, the temple transformed into a sanctuary of divine service. Pilgrims believed that joining with a priestess of Aphrodite brought blessings from the goddess herself. The priestesses believed, or were told to believe, that their bodies were instruments of worship. To the outside world, these women were revered. To history, they are ghosts. No names survive, only numbers carved into ledgers describing offerings, perfumes, and gold coins left at their feet. The men who sought them remembered only the promise of divine approval. The women remembered nothing, because their memories were never written down. Dionysus and Aphrodite ecstasy and beauty formed the two poles of Greek desire. One tore down reason, the other sanctified pleasure. Together they created a culture where transgression was theology. In Athens, festivals for Dionysus were state events. The same city that outlawed public indecency hosted parades of actors wearing leather symbols of virility, cheered by crowds calling it art. That contradiction was the essence of Greece. To polish chaos until it shone like virtue. Even philosophers participated. Aristotle attended the theater dedicated to Dionysus, where tragedies unfolded as moral instruction. Yet the origin of those dramas lay in ritual chants that once ended with animal sacrifice and human trance. Civilization did not replace the primal elite learned to stage it. For ordinary Greeks, these festivals were relief valves. A year of discipline could be undone in one night of sacred disorder. Slaves drank with masters. Women shouted louder than men. The hierarchy inverted itself and called it worship. When dawn came, everyone returned to their roles, hungover but obedient. The chaos had done its work. It reminded them that freedom existed only by permission of the gods. There are accounts, half history, half warning, of celebrations that went too far. Villages waking to find the woods scattered with torn garlands and broken instruments. People missing. Priests claiming divine possession to explain what the law could not. The Greeks never denied these stories. They folded them into myth. Anything could be forgiven if a god had caused it. In the ruins of Delphi, archaeologists once uncovered a small inscription carved into a stone wall behind the temple. It reads, "Know thyself." To modern eyes, it seems like a call to introspection. To the Greeks, it was a warning. Because in the world of Dionysus and Aphrodite, knowing oneself meant confronting the truth that humans crave both order and oblivion, and that the distance between them is only a single cup of wine. As the torches on Cithaeron fade, the drums slow to silence. The worshippers collapse in the grass, their faces streaked with ash and sweat. Somewhere in the valley, the first light of dawn touches the city's white columns, restoring reason for another day. But for a few hours each night, Greece remembered what it tried to forget, that beneath every philosophy lies a beating heart that still wants to burn. Morning light falls cold across the Athenian marketplace. Statues of marble youth line the square, their eyes fixed forever on some distant perfection. Tourists see beauty here. But if you could walk through time, you'd hear the other sounds beneath the chatter of merchants, the iron rattle of chains, the cries of children sold with amphorae and livestock. Greece built its temples on the backs of those who would never enter them. Every philosopher, every poet, every statesman relied on the same silent workforce. For every symposium where wisdom and wine flowed freely, dozens of unseen hands filled the cups. The Greeks called slavery necessary. They said it allowed free men to pursue virtue and art. But every civilization that calls exploitation necessary eventually learns how easy it is to make cruelty sound rational. In Athens, there were brothels owned by the state itself, an institution as ordinary as the marketplace. They were not hidden, not shamed. The taxes from them funded public buildings, festivals, even temples. The city of reason financed itself through human bodies and called it practical governance. The men who visited claimed the right of release. The women who served were commodities, some trained from childhood, some captured in war, others sold by families to escape hunger. Historians call them pornai, the root of a word still used today. Their names rarely appear in records. They were cataloged by price, location, and age, not by story. Athens intellectuals debated virtue while walking past the doorways where those women waited. No one saw a contradiction. Virtue was for citizens. Everyone else was currency. There were other women, the hetairai educated courtesans who entertained the elite. They played music, discussed philosophy, and dined with the men who excluded wives from public life. They were celebrated, painted, remembered in poetry, but even their freedom was a performance. They could rise high, but only as long as their patrons found them useful. The moment youth faded or a rival appeared, admiration turned to erasure. One such woman, Aspasia of Miletus, defied the pattern for a time. She was said to advise Pericles himself, shaping the policies of an empire from behind closed doors. Yet when Athens sought to blame someone for its moral decline, they blamed her, the foreign woman who dared to speak. When power fails, the first target is always the voice that was never meant to be heard. If the temples of Aphrodite made desire divine, the streets of Athens made it profitable. And for those at the bottom, pleasure was never a choice. The inscriptions that survive tell stories too cold to romanticize lists of transactions, punishments, inventories. One fragment from Piraeus records the sale of a Thracian girl for service and training, her price less than a pair of fine sandals. Another notes repairs to a brothel wall after a revolt. The word repairs hides more screams than any tragedy ever written. The Greeks gave the world theater, but they also perfected the stage of denial. For every audience applauding a tragedy about suffering, hundreds lived it outside the theater. The audience wept safely and left feeling moral. It is an old trick, still practiced today. Sparta told a different story but carried the same burden. Its citizens prided themselves on equality, but only among Spartans. Beneath them were the helots, enslaved populations who worked the fields and raised the food that fed the soldiers' discipline. Once a year, young Spartans were permitted to hunt helots as sport. A ritual they claimed preserved order. They called it purification. Every empire invents rituals to make its atrocities sound sacred. Historians like to speak of the Greek miracle, the sudden flowering of art, democracy, and philosophy. But miracles always have a cost. The Greek world was not built solely by genius. It was built by a hierarchy so rigid it could be mistaken for divine law. Men above women, citizens above slaves, reason above mercy. And yet, every great work of art they produced glows with unease, as if even the sculptors sensed the contradiction. Look at the statues again, the flawless skin, the calm expression. They are not portraits of people. They are monuments to an idea, that perfection justifies everything required to achieve it. In the Agora, a philosopher once told his students that freedom was the highest good. A few steps away, a slave trader announced his prices. Neither saw irony. Civilization doesn't erase cruelty. It organizes it. Greece's genius lay not in escaping the primal instincts of humanity, but in teaching the world how to ritualize them. They made desire into theology, domination into pedagogy, exploitation into economy. And in doing so, they built a culture that still defines beauty even as it buried the people who paid for it. Stand among the ruins of a Greek temple and you will feel it. The echo of something that was never quite human. Marble columns reach toward an empty sky, their surfaces eroded by centuries of wind and salt. Yet the air still vibrates with reverence. Pilgrims once climbed these same steps, carrying sacrifices, prayers, and secrets. They believed the gods were watching. They were right, but the gaze that looked back was their own. Every myth the Greeks told was a mirror. Their gods were not moral guardians. They were amplifiers of human appetite. Zeus ruled through desire, taking whatever form his impulses required. Aphrodite embodied beauty so powerful it ruined those who worshipped her. Dionysus demanded surrender, not prayer. Even Athena, the virgin goddess of wisdom, was born from the head of a man. A symbol of thought, divorced from compassion. The pantheon was less a family of deities than a system of excuses, divine models for human excess. When Zeus abducted, poets called it passion. When Hera raged, they called it jealousy, not justice. Each story taught the same lesson. Power sanctifies appetite. And mortals learned it well. The philosophers tried to impose order on this chaos. They drew diagrams of virtue and called them ethics, argued that reason should rule emotion. But myths outlast logic because they promise what logic never can: absolution. If the gods themselves broke boundaries, how could mortals be condemned for following? In every city stood altars where violence and pleasure were intertwined. A sacrifice before battle, a feast after victory, a festival to appease Dionysus with wine and delirium. The Greeks believed balance came from acknowledging both the noble and the obscene. They never hid their contradictions. They built temples to them. What survived of their world is curated marble and filtered sunlight. Museums display fragments of perfection, stripped of their noise and smell. The inscriptions describing human offerings are tucked away in archives, too fragile for public view. Tourists photograph columns and call it civilization, unaware that the ground beneath their feet once drank both blood and perfume. History has a habit of sanding off the edges of horror until only beauty remains. The Greeks mastered that transformation. They carved their sins into stone so exquisitely that future generations mistook them for ideals. When Rome inherited their gods, it inherited their logic. That indulgence could be order. That dominance could be divine right. When Europe rediscovered Greece during the Renaissance, it resurrected the art but forgot the cost. We still quote their philosophers, still admire their symmetry, still chase their idea of beauty. We rarely ask whose reflection we are imitating. In the end, Greece fell not from invasion, but from exhaustion. A society cannot live forever in worship of its own image. The wars with Persia drained its strength. The wars between its cities drained its soul. The philosophers who once debated the meaning of virtue lived to see mercenaries auctioning children in the same squares where Socrates had preached wisdom. The temples stood, but the faith had hollowed out. Even the gods seemed tired of being mirrors for human appetite. When the Romans came, they absorbed everything art, architecture, mythology, because Greece had already taught the world the most seductive idea in history. That culture can make anything beautiful, even cruelty, especially cruelty. If you walk the Acropolis today, you'll see restorations everywhere. Scaffolding, cranes, marble dust floating in sunlight. The guidebooks say the work is preservation, but it feels more like concealment. We rebuild the ruins to reassure ourselves that civilization endures. Yet the lesson of Greece is that civilization is never destroyed by barbarians. It collapses under the weight of its own perfection. Beneath every marble floor, there are layers of forgotten lives, slaves, courtesans, disciples, victims buried not by accident, but by design. The Greeks invented democracy, but only for men. Philosophy, but only for the free. Beauty, but only for the admired. For everyone else, the gods offered silence. Perhaps that is why their ruins still haunt us. Because somewhere deep down, we recognize ourselves in them. We still build systems that glorify brilliance while feeding on the invisible. We still carve ideals out of suffering and call it progress. We still worship beauty as though it were proof of virtue. The Greeks understood what most civilizations deny, that the divine and the monstrous often share a face. They called it mythology. We call it history. And history, as always, is just humanity trying to forgive itself in stone.